spirit of Ralph Ellis.
They cut our tongues. They left us speechless. They cut our tongues. Lord, they left us without words. Amen. They scattered our tongues on this land like seed and left us without language. They took away our talking drums. Happy New Day.
Happy New Day.
I am Ralph Ellison, born March 1st, 1913 in Oklahoma City. My parents named me after a famous writer named Ralph Waldo Emerson. Interesting, right? My father delivered ice and cold to business. One day, a slab of ice down from in his stomach, killing him. My mother instantly became a single mother, working many jobs, and she did her best. At the age of 8, I fell in love with music and instruments. I learned how to play the trumpet. Jazz and classical are my favorite. At 19 years old, I went to Tuskegee Institute as a music major. My senior year, I moved to New York City to earn enough money, but I didn't earn enough money, and plus the music program closed. My mother passed away in 1937. My brother and I moved to Ohio to hunt for a living. And I wrote at night and studied literature. Later that year, I moved back to New York City, where Langston Hughes introduced me to Richard Wright. Wright encouraged my passion of writing. I published my first short story and book review. In 1942, I became the editor of the Negro Quarterly. Then I joined the Marines, where I was a cook for 2 years. I can throw down in the kitchen. I was grateful to have a grant to write a novel. When I became sick after drinking tainted water off a ship, I began writing Invisible Man. 7 years later, it was published. I won an award for it. I enjoy traveling the world and being a professor, sharing my knowledge about writing. Many pages of my second novel went up in flames when my house caught on fire. Can you believe Invisible Man was banned from some North Carolina schools in 2013? Remember this, I am invisible. Understand simply, people refuse to see me. Thank you, I am Ralph Ellison.
Okay, we are now bringing on one of our elders who once you hear this presentation, you'll remember from earlier during our presentation. And this is Elder Varnell Bename, and he is here in the spirit of James Weldon Johnson.
And God stepped out in space. He looked around and said, I'm lonely. I'll make me a world. And as far as the eyes of God could see, darkness covered everything. Darker than 100 midnights in a cypress swamp. Then God smiled, and the light broke, and the darkness rolled up on one side, and the light stood shining on the other side. And God said, that's good. And God reached out and lifted the light, grabbed it in his hands. And he started rolling the light in his hands until he created the sun. And then he flung it he flung it into the heavens. And the light that was left over, he gathered. He gathered the light that was left over and balled it into a shining ball and flung it against the darkness. spangling the night with the moons and the stars. And then between the darkness and the light, God hurled the world and said, "That's good." I'm James Weldon Johnson, born in Jacksonville, Florida in 1871. I was often encouraged to study music literature. I graduated at Atlanta University, and when I came home, I became a principal at a public school. My mother became the first African-American public school teacher. I studied law and became the first African-American to pass the Florida bar exam. I founded a newspaper, the Daily American newspaper, which was aimed at the African-Americans in our city. So not only was I also a U.S. diplomat, but I was also a civil rights leader. Now, many of you may know me for many things. I was also an author. In 1912, I wrote a book called The Autobiography of an Ex-Slave, Autobiography of an Ex-Black Man. It was aimed at really dealing with the identity crisis with the black people within the 20th century. In 1930, I became a professor at Fisk University, where I studied and taught creative literature. But the work that I'm most notably known for is a piece of work that I wrote as a poem. Now, many would muse that that poem had anything to do with Abraham Lincoln, but that's a story for a different time. But what my brother was able to do was to add music to it. And for many of you, you now call it the Black National Anthem. To me, I say lift every voice and sing.
Okay, now if I say to you, this next person is going to have you go home and start digging in your crates. Okay, now some people may not know what that means. You're a 70s baby, a little older than that, you'll understand.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. But this one definitely is going to have you digging in the crates. This next one has also taken poetry and put it to words. Coming to you next is going to be Tyreek Dye, and he is definitely bringing the spirit of Brother Gil Scott Perry.
Good evening, my brothers and sisters.
Good evening.
The revolution will not be televised. Will not be televised. Will not be televised. The revolution will be no rerun, brothers. The revolution will be live. Good evening.
Good evening. Good evening.
I am Gil Scott Heron. I was born on April 1st, 1949. Just to start off, I am one of the most outspoken people in the world. I am a rapper, singer, and poet. I inspired a lot of people with my favorite songs, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. In my early life when I was young, I was living with my mom in New York City. But one of my bad days when I was young is when my mom and my dad got divorced. I was in so much pain that day. Man, I was crying a lot too. Man, you wouldn't even notice how bad it was. But, you know, stuff comes and goes. So what I did was to let go of that pain. I started writing poems. By the age of 13, I had my first collection of poems, using my own voice for the liberation of black people. And before I go, I'm going to say a tone. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be right back after a message
strong boys than repair broken men. Say it with me.
It is better to build strong boys than repair broken men.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
My name is Frederick Douglass, and for those of you who don't know anything about me, just a little backstory. I was born on the eastern shores of Maryland in 1818. Around the age of 10, my slave master's wife taught me the alphabet, and after learning the alphabet, I taught myself how to read and write. After my slave master found out I was teaching other slaves how to read and write after I taught myself, he proceeded to send me to a man named Edward Covey, who was known in the area as the slave breaker. But Covey couldn't break me. Around the age of 20, I proceeded to beat this man up for 2 hours before running away to Massachusetts for my freedom. Now, most of you know me from my work as an abolitionist speaker. I traveled the country, and some might even say the globe, or part of it, spreading my own experiences being born into slavery. I talked about the blood as I saw it drip from my brothers and sisters' back after getting whipped, and their screams and their cries as they would get raped by the massa at night. And this touched me. But I talked very eloquently because I'm able to read and write. I read a lot. And so people doubted I was actually ever a slave. They said, well, if this man knows so many big words, and he knows how to formulate such great sentences, how could he have been a slave? I can do nothing but tell him my story. Now, because of a law known as the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, I was at risk of being taken back to the eastern shores of Maryland. In fact, I was originally born Frederick Bailey, but changed my last name to Douglas so I wouldn't be taken back. I led a campaign across Britain and Ireland to raise money to buy my freedom back, and in 1846 I did just that, and proceeded to start a newspaper company in 1847, known as the North Star Newspaper Company. This company went on to run and have multiple abolitionist articles promoting the abolishment of slavery and the freedom of all slaves, as well as other civil liberties that people should have. I also proceeded to buy a house in Washington, D.C., on a place called Cedar Hill. And I specifically chose this house for a multitude of reasons. But the two that stuck out to me the most, because from my front porch, I could see out all the way over Washington, D.C. I could see the White House, and I could see the King Monument, and everything, even though it wasn't there when I first bought it. But I could see all the way out to the eastern shores of Maryland, where I got my start. My newspaper company eventually merged with another newspaper company in the New York area to create Douglas's newspaper that went on to run for multiple years later. And so, before I go, I want to leave you with this. Without struggle, there is no progress. Say it with me.
Without struggle, there is no progress.